Before we begin tonight's story, take a deep breath and let the day fade. Maybe dim the lights, settle into your chair or bed, and allow yourself to relax. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, don't forget to like, comment where you're listening from, and subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories. Now, let's step into the silence together. The night air on Staten Island carried a chill, the kind that sharpened every sound. A car door clicked shut, a leaf scraped across the pavement, and somewhere far off a dog barked once, then went quiet. From the shadow of a sedan, Aniello Dellacroce stepped into the street. He did not hurry. He never did. His overcoat swayed lightly in the breeze, his shoes clicking in a rhythm steady as a metronome. He walked not to announce himself, but to remind the block that it was his, though no one would ever dare to say it out loud. They called him the Silent Monk. The name clung to him like smoke. Not because he lived in holy walls, but because silence was his creed. He spoke sparingly, moved with purpose, and gave nothing away. When Aniello looked at you, you felt measured, your past, your present, your future, all weighed in a stare that never rushed and never blinked. Isn't it strange how sometimes the quietest man leaves the loudest mark? His house was modest, a two-story colonial with pale siding and a walkway lined by stone. No guards at the door, no polished cars stacked in the driveway. Inside, the air held the faint scent of basil from lunch. A crucifix hung above the mantel. A leather chair sat by the clock, its surface worn smooth by years. The ticking filled the room like a second heartbeat. The place was as unadorned as its master, neat, disciplined, stripped of vanity. Aniello removed his coat, hung it carefully on the same hook it always hung, and sat at the kitchen table. A simple lamp cast a circle of light across the wood. His coffee steamed faintly. The silence pressed in, not uncomfortable, but firm. It was here, at this plain table, that decisions rippled across the most powerful crime family in America. A car slowed outside. Aniello didn't look up. He already knew who it was. The engine idled a moment, then cut. A knock followed, 2 taps, then 1. Not a code from a book, just a habit of respect. "Come in," Aniello said, his voice low, steady. A young man entered, hat in his hands, eyes lowered. He stood by the door until Aniello gave the smallest nod. Only then did he sit. "There's talk," the boy began, keeping his tone hushed. "Red Hook. A shipment moved without clearance." Aniello let the words float. He lifted his cup, sipped once, and set it down. His eyes didn't shift, but the boy swallowed hard. "Some people," Aniello said, "is not a name." "Gennaro's crew," the boy admitted. "They think Paul's busy elsewhere. They say the streets don't answer to the hill anymore." Aniello rose slowly, rinsed his cup at the sink, dried it with care. "Find who spoke first," he said. "The first word tells you the last man." Then, after a pause, "Not Gennaro. His barber." The boy understood, stood, and left. Outside, the car engine hummed back to life, fading into the night. Aniello returned the cup to its shelf, then reached for his cigarettes. But instead of lighting one, he paused. His mind had already gone back, not to Gennaro, not to Paul Castellano, but to East Harlem. To the boy he once was, sitting in an alley, watching, learning that silence was more powerful than fists. And in that moment, the past came back brick by brick, as if the streets of Harlem were still beneath his shoes. East Harlem in the 1920s was a place that never slept. The streets echoed with jazz drifting from radios, with men arguing about money they didn't have, and with kids chasing one another between rows of brick buildings. But in the middle of all that noise, there was one boy who rarely added to it. Aniello Dellacroce would sit in the narrow alley behind his family's apartment, elbows resting on his knees, eyes sharp and steady. He wasn't the type to shout or fight for attention. He preferred corners where he could see everything but stay unseen himself. Even then, silence was his shield. His father worked long days laying brick until his hands looked like stone. His mother scrubbed floors until they glistened, then prayed in Italian under her breath as if her words could keep the family safe. Aniello was their quiet child, the one who never complained when the food was thin, never argued for the last piece of bread. At family dinners, he stayed so still and Uncle once asked if he'd fallen asleep. But Aniello wasn't asleep. He was memorizing the shifts in voices, the way his father's tone dropped when rent was late, how his mother's laughter covered her worry. He was studying how silence revealed more than words ever could. By the time he was 12, the streets had noticed him. Sally Butcher Capelli, a man with a reputation for both meat and muscle, handed him a paper bag one afternoon without explanation. Aniello carried it across town, never looking inside, never slowing his step even when a patrolman strolled by. He returned it just before dusk. Sally didn't smile, didn't praise him, just pressed a quarter into his palm. That quiet nod was worth more than a full speech. It meant Aniello could be trusted. Isn't that what every man is searching for, to be trusted without having to speak a word? As the years passed, he became known as a boy who didn't brag. While others shouted about errands they ran or fights they picked, Aniello kept his mouth shut. When he was 14, a boy named Frankie slapped him on a dare. Aniello didn't yell. He didn't chase. He grabbed Frankie by the ears and drove his knee into the boy's nose until it bent sideways. Then he walked home as if nothing had happened. Word spread faster than Frankie's blood dried. No one remembered Frankie's dare, they remembered Aniello's silence. The depression made the neighborhood harder, tighter. Families who had little now had less. Young men turned to the streets, calling it work when the law called it crime. Aniello moved among them, careful, quiet, never chasing the spotlight. At 16 he started shadowing older boys on collections, studying how they knocked on doors, how they didn't flinch when people begged, how they kept their words short and left before neighbors could ask questions. He noticed the pattern: the loudest men were the first to fall. The quiet ones lasted. One evening, he delivered a message from a capo to a shopkeeper. He said almost nothing, just accepted a cup of coffee, left, and waited. By morning, the money appeared without fuss. No police, no broken glass, no threats. Only silence, and silence had done the work. Years later, when men called him the silent monk, they pointed back to these days. The boy who didn't squabble, didn't boast, didn't explain. He simply acted and let the silence speak for him. Even as a teenager, Aniello was becoming something rare, a figure whose power grew not from words or weapons, but from the weight of what he chose not to say. By 19, Aniello had already stepped deeper into the underworld than most men twice his age. He moved quietly, always in the background, never asking for credit. That's how he caught the eye of Albert Anastasia, a man whose name carried the weight of thunder in New York. Anastasia was fire, sudden and fierce, feared for his temper and his ruthlessness. Aniello was stone, cold, patient, unshaken. Together, they made a strange balance. Anastasia spoke in commands, Aniello answered with nods. Anastasia exploded in rage, Aniello sat in silence, and somehow that silence carried its own kind of threat. Anastasia liked Aniello because he didn't flinch. Jobs got done, and Aniello never left trails. He didn't linger in bars retelling stories. He didn't spend money on showgirls or flashy suits. He wore dark jackets, plain ties, polished shoes, clothing that blended into shadows. While other young men dreamed of climbing the ladder fast, Aniello stayed close to the floor, observing, waiting. That patience made him dangerous in a world where impatience often meant death. He learned lessons that shaped him for life. Violence was a tool, but not the only one. Aniello didn't enjoy it, but he knew when to use it. If someone cheated, he didn't rush to break bones. Sometimes, he simply sat across from the man, sipped an espresso, and let the silence hang heavy. Men confessed things to Aniello just to end the pause. More than once, money showed up the next morning without Aniello having to say a single word. Isn't it strange how silence can press harder on a man's chest than fists ever could? Stories began to travel. One told of Vinny, a soldier skimming money. Aniello didn't confront him directly. Instead, he walked into Vinny's brother's bakery, bought a loaf of bread, and paid exact change without a word. By the next sunrise, Vinny returned double what he'd taken. No threats. No fight. Just the quiet message that Aniello's silence had already decided his fate. People started calling him stone-faced. They noticed how he rarely smiled, how he could sit through long meetings without blinking, how he smirked only when someone said something foolish. And when he did speak, it was never wasted. Every sentence carried weight because he used so few of them. By his early 20s, Aniello had become the man you called when discretion mattered. He wasn't the strongest or the flashiest, but he was the most reliable. In a world where loud men fell fast, Aniello's stillness kept him standing. That quiet strength drew him closer to the center of the Gambino family, still forming its shape under bosses who valued control. He was never the one pounding the table or making speeches. He sat a step behind the throne, eyes steady, listening to every word, remembering every detail. And men began to realize something: silence wasn't just Aniello's habit. It was his power. In the streets, that kind of power could make a man untouchable. By the mid-1950s, Aniello's life had taken on a rhythm as steady as the tick of the clock in his Staten Island home. He had chosen a modest neighborhood, not the kind with wide lawns and new Cadillacs in every driveway, but a quieter place where curtains stayed drawn and neighbors minded their own business. His house was plain, 2 stories, white siding, a narrow walkway of stone leading to the front door. Inside, everything was neat, stripped of excess. A crucifix above the mantel, a single chair with worn leather, an ashtray always emptied, a kitchen table polished smooth. It looked less like a gangster's hideout and more like a monk's retreat, which is how the name began, half a joke whispered by soldiers who noticed his discipline. But the name stuck, and soon men used it with respect: the silent monk. His home became a kind of temple for the family. Soldiers arrived early in the morning and left before neighbors were awake. They never lingered, never joked on the porch. They sat at his table, received a nod, maybe a sentence or two, and left with their course set. No yelling, no show of power, just decisions carved in quiet. It was here that Aniello's reputation grew into something mythic. He didn't act like a man chasing thrones, he acted like a man guarding order. And in that order, the Gambino family found strength. At this time, Albert Anastasia still burned hot, his temper often pulling the family into storms. Aniello was the stone that kept the fire from spreading too far. He offered patience when Anastasia wanted speed, silence when Anastasia wanted spectacle. Many didn't see it, but Aniello's restraint balanced the entire family. He had become the unseen weight that kept the scale steady. The FBI began to notice too. By the mid-50s, his name appeared in their notes as a silent coordinator. They planted wires, tapped phones, followed him at a distance. But Aniello never gave them what they wanted. He didn't speak freely on phones. He didn't slip in bars. He didn't brag. He moved like static, always present, impossible to record. Agents wrote in frustration, known to be involved, but evidence lacking. That absence of proof was his shield, built from the same silence that shaped his life. Stories from this era still travel. One tells of Eddie Pockets, a young enforcer who made a mess in Brooklyn by drawing too much attention. Instead of beating him or worse, Aniello invited him into the Staten Island kitchen, poured him coffee, and asked one question: "What do you want your mother to think when the headlines come?" Eddie broke before the spoon touched the saucer. Within a week, he was moved to quiet work far from the spotlight. No threats, no blood. Just a reminder that silence can strip a man bare. By the late 50s, everyone understood the truth. Carlo Gambino might have been the boss, but Aniello was the altar the men faced. He didn't need to shout or posture. His stillness alone was enough. And in that stillness, the legend of the silent monk grew larger than anyone could have predicted. October 1957 changed everything. Albert Anastasia, the fiery boss Aniello had balanced for years, walked into a Manhattan barber shop and never walked out. The gunman came fast, masks pulled low, bullets flying while a towel was still wrapped around his neck. The barber dropped his scissors, frozen in place, as Anastasia collapsed beneath the mirror. It was one of the most shocking mob hits New York had ever seen, and with it, a chapter closed. Aniello wasn't there, but when the news reached him, the silence in his Staten Island home deepened. For 3 days, he stayed out of sight. No visits to the Ravenite, no knocks on his door. When he finally reappeared, nothing in his face revealed grief or anger, but those who knew him could sense it. Something inside had hardened. Most expected Aniello to step forward, to stake his claim as the next boss. He had the loyalty of the soldiers, the discipline, the respect. But instead, Carlo Gambino emerged as head of the family. Carlo was shrewd, soft-spoken, a man who believed in strategy over spectacle. To outsiders, it looked like Aniello had been passed over. But inside, those who paid attention saw it differently. Aniello bowed his head, stayed silent, and accepted the role of underboss. It wasn't weakness, it was his way. He didn't crave the throne. He craved order. And by serving as Carlo's second, he could guarantee it. Together, Carlo and Aniello formed one of the strongest partnerships in mob history. Carlo handled alliances, politics, and business. Aniello managed the streets, kept the soldiers disciplined, made sure disputes didn't spill into chaos. If Carlo was the architect, Aniello was the foundation. Quiet, unshakable, unseen but essential. His Staten Island home grew busier, though it never looked it. Cars came at odd hours, left quickly, never blocked the street. Soldiers stepped inside, lowered their voices, and walked out with their futures decided in a handful of words. If Aniello spoke at all, it was brief, a warning, a nod, an instruction stripped to its bones. Those who walked out often said they felt like they had been judged without trial, and in a way, they had. One story from these years followed a mid-level earner, Tony Button's fear. Tony was dipping into 2 different pockets, taking money from both sides of a deal. Aniello didn't call him in, didn't raise his voice, didn't send muscle. He simply waited. Weeks passed, and then Tony was gone. No scene, no headlines. Months later, a shoe washed ashore in Jersey. Nobody claimed it. The streets understood the lesson. Aniello's silence wasn't absence. It was verdict. This made him feared in a way louder men never were. In one case, 2 soldiers nearly came to blows outside a nightclub over territory. By dawn, both were called, one at a time, into Aniello's Staten Island kitchen. Neither man was harmed. Both simply vanished from the city within a week. One ended up running a small car wash in Florida, the other working quietly in another borough. No one doubted the message. Aniello didn't need to draw blood if silence could end a fight forever. By the early 1960s, the Gambinos ran like a machine. Money flowed, alliances held, and the streets stayed calm. Some gave Carlo the credit, and rightly so. But inside the family, everyone knew better. The calm belonged to Aniello. His silence had become law. The 1960s brought a wave of change across America, music blaring from radios, protests filling streets, new laws reshaping lives. But inside the Gambino family, Aniello Dellacroce moved as if time itself bent around him. Each morning on Staten Island, he rose early, brewed his coffee black and strong, and unfolded the paper with careful hands. He skimmed the headlines, wars, elections, scandals, but what mattered most was never printed. The real news arrived later, carried by men who knocked quietly and left quickly. By mid-morning, Aniello was often at the Ravenite Social Club. He sat in the back corner, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, smoke curling like incense in a chapel. Men entered laughing, voices raised, but as soon as they spotted him, the noise dimmed. Jokes were cut short, arguments lowered. He didn't demand silence, it happened naturally, as though the air thickened in his presence. A nod from Aniello could settle a dispute that might have otherwise spilled blood. Isn't it strange how a single glance can weigh more than a dozen threats? Over time, even the younger capos started to copy him. They traded loud ties for plain suits, flashy shoes for polished leather. They spoke less, listened more. Without speeches or commands, Aniello reshaped the culture around him. His stillness became contagious. Law enforcement took notice too, but for different reasons. The FBI had grown sharper, planting bugs in bars, wiring phones, flipping men who thought they could hide their secrets. Yet when it came to Aniello, they came up empty. He didn't speak freely on phones. He didn't let informants close. Even those who wanted to betray him had nothing useful to share. In one report, an agent described him as white noise, always there, but impossible to record. His bond with Carlo Gambino deepened in those years. Carlo was careful, preferring diplomacy and quiet deals over street violence. Aniello balanced him perfectly. Where Carlo negotiated, Aniello enforced. They shared an unspoken understanding. One ran the boardroom, the other kept order in the streets. Together, they built a dynasty. One story from these days still makes the rounds. A soldier raised his voice during a sit-down, anger boiling over disputed territory. Aniello didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply held the man's gaze until the color drained from his face. The soldier stammered, apologized, not for the dispute, but for being loud. That was Aniello's gift. He didn't win arguments. He ended them. Outside the club, his life stayed simple. He cooked alone, mostly pasta or soup. He walked his Staten Island block at dusk, hands in his pockets, never with bodyguards. When asked once why he didn't surround himself with protection like other underbosses, he said, "If I need guards, I already lost." That line spread quickly, whispered like gospel. It was Aniello in a single sentence, calm, certain, unshakable. But even as he kept the family steady, the streets were changing. A new generation of gangsters was rising. Louder, flashier, hungry for headlines. One name stood out, John Gotti. Brash, magnetic, quick to smile and quicker to anger. He was everything Aniello was not. And yet, when Gotti came near him, even he slowed down, listening more, talking less. He respected the silent monk, and in his own way, sought his approval. Aniello didn't push him forward, but he didn't stop him either. He studied him, the way he studied all storms, patiently, with the knowledge that sooner or later, storms always break. For now, the balance held. Carlo sat at the top, Aniello anchored the streets, and the Gambino family moved like a well-oiled machine. But Aniello knew the truth better than anyone: silence can hold order only for so long. Sooner or later, noise finds its way in. When Carlo Gambino passed in 1976, the family gathered with unease. For decades, Aniello had been the one soldiers trusted to steady the ship, the man whose nod carried more weight than any title. Many expected him to take the throne. In the back rooms and smoky bars, whispers circled, "Neil will be boss now." But Carlo had left instructions. He wanted Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, to succeed him. Paul was different. He lived in a mansion on Toad Hill, far from the streets that kept the family alive. He preferred boardrooms to bars, contracts to corners. He built his circle around relatives and businessmen, not the blue-collar earners who risked their lives each day. To the soldiers, he felt distant, even arrogant. And so they turned their eyes back to Neil. Because while Paul held the title, Aniello still held their respect. At his modest Staten Island home, the rhythm continued. Cars pulled up at odd hours, left before sunrise. Men came nervous, hats in hand, and sat at the kitchen table where a lamp cast a soft glow. Aniello listened more than he spoke. Sometimes all they received was a single sentence. Sometimes just a glance. But that was enough. If Neil knew, the matter was decided. Even Paul understood it. He might have been boss, but he never tried to strip Aniello of his influence. He knew better. He left the streets to Neil, trusting that his discipline would keep the money flowing and the blood from spilling too freely. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Castellano's mansion became a fortress, guarded and cut off. He surrounded himself with men in suits who spoke of contracts and profits while ignoring the bruised knuckles of the earners. On the streets, resentment grew. Men felt overlooked, cheated of recognition. And in the shadows, John Gotti's star rose brighter. Gotti was everything Paul wasn't. Loud, fiery, draped in silk ties and swagger. He drew the younger soldiers like a flame draws moths. Yet even Gotti, restless and brash, bowed his head in Neil's presence. At wakes, weddings, sit-downs, he lingered near him, soaking up every nod, every word, as though they were scripture. To outsiders, it looked like mentorship. In truth, Aniello wasn't grooming anyone. He was simply watching, weighing. But by not silencing Gotti, by allowing his fire to grow unchecked, he was shaping the future without ever lifting a hand. The FBI noticed it too. Reports noted that rank-and-file soldiers looked to Neil more than Paul. They wrote that Dellacroce's discipline was the glue keeping the family from open conflict. And they weren't wrong. His silence, the same silence he had carried from Harlem alleys to Staten Island kitchens, was still the law of the Gambinos. By then, Aniello was in his 60s. His hair had thinned, his frame carried the years, but his eyes stayed sharp. He never needed to shout, never needed to show force. His presence was enough. Yet even he could feel it, Paul's detachment, Gotti's ambition, the whispers in the clubs. The air was changing. And as Aniello sat at his table, cigarette smoke curling upward, he knew something with certainty: his silence might not hold forever. By the early 1980s, the cracks in the family were no longer whispers, they were visible lines running through every crew, every corner, every conversation. Paul Castellano ruled from his mansion on Toad Hill, surrounded by businessmen and relatives, while the soldiers who earned their keep on the streets felt abandoned. They wanted a boss who understood them, who knew what it meant to risk prison or worse for a bundle of cash. And in their frustration, their eyes always circled back to Neil. Aniello Dellacroce was no longer young. The cough that once came and went had settled in his chest, sharp and constant. His suits hung looser now, his once steady hands shook when he lit a cigarette. But even as illness wore his body down, his presence never lost its weight. He still appeared at the Ravenite Social Club, walking slowly but with purpose. The moment he entered, voices dropped. Men adjusted their jackets, sat straighter, lowered their eyes. Even sick, Neil's silence could still command the room. The FBI noticed. Agents wrote in their reports that Dellacroce looked frail, pale, thinner than ever. Yet they also noted something else: his authority hadn't weakened. Dellacroce's presence continues to stabilize tensions, one report read. They understood what every man inside the family knew, that Aniello's silence was the last dam holding back a flood. Without him, Castellano's cold detachment and Gotti's rising fire would crash into each other, and the result would be war. At home on Staten Island, his house grew quieter. The crucifix still hung above the mantel, the clock still ticked in its steady rhythm, the ashtray was still emptied each night. Soldiers visited one by one, never staying long, never laughing in the driveway. They came with problems, disputes, fears. They left with answers, sometimes just a nod, sometimes a single sentence. A man might spend 10 minutes in Aniello's kitchen and walk out feeling like his fate had been sealed. That was the weight of Neil's silence. Gotti visited often. Brash, restless, impatient with Castellano's distant style, he confided his frustrations to Neil. They would sit in parked cars, the windows fogging in the cold, and Gotti would speak quickly, voice rising. Aniello never raised his in return. He would listen, smoke curling from his hand, and after long pauses, offer only a few words. Once, when Gotti seethed over being overlooked, Neil simply said, "Loud men don't finish well." Gotti said nothing back. He didn't have to. He understood. But Aniello also understood something deeper. His illness was winning. The family was leaning on his silence, but his body couldn't carry it forever. He never admitted it, not to his soldiers, not to Gotti, not even to the priests who visited quietly. Still, in the late hours, sitting alone in his kitchen with the television murmuring in the background, he knew. Every cough, every tremor in his hand was a reminder, time was running short. And when his silence was gone, there would be no one left to keep the noise at bay. By late 1985, the weight of time was written across Aniello's face. His once broad frame had shrunk, his shoulders narrow under coats that used to fit snug. His cough rattled in the silence, and his hands trembled when he lifted a cigarette. Yet still, every week, he made the walk into the Ravenite Social Club. The soldiers saw the frailty, but they also saw something stronger, the will of a man who refused to vanish while orders still depended on him. Even in sickness, his presence kept the room steady. Voices softened, arguments dissolved, and men leaned in closer so as not to miss a single quiet word. The FBI was watching, too. Their reports described his thinning body, his pale face, the way he paused to catch his breath. They scribbled observations about his failing health, but they all noted the same fact: he remained the anchor. Without Dellacroce, one agent wrote, the Gambino family may fracture. The Bureau knew what the family already felt in their bones, that Neil's silence was the only thing keeping Castellano's cold distance and Gotti's restless fire from colliding. At his Staten Island home, the ritual never changed. The crucifix still hung above the mantel. The ashtray was still emptied each night. The clock ticked in its steady rhythm. Soldiers came one at a time, sat in his kitchen under the soft glow of the lamp, and waited. Sometimes Aniello gave them a sentence. Sometimes only a look. And somehow that was enough. They walked out with decisions etched into them like scripture. No one questioned it. His silence had become the family's law. Gotti came more often than most. His charisma and ambition were no longer secrets. He was impatient with Paul Castellano's distant, businessman ways. In the back seat of parked cars, or in short, quiet walks, Gotti spoke with urgency, with heat. Neil listened, letting the fire burn itself out. Then, when the silence pressed hard enough, he gave his counsel in fragments. Once, when Gotti raged about being overlooked, Aniello murmured, "When the dam breaks, don't be standing in front of it." He didn't need to explain. Gotti heard the warning beneath the words. Meanwhile, Castellano grew more paranoid, retreating further into his mansion, trusting fewer men, cutting himself off from the very soldiers who fed the empire. He surrounded himself with relatives and businessmen, men who knew contracts but not the streets. To Aniello, it was a betrayal of the code. Yet still, he didn't speak openly against Paul. He never had. He simply held the family together with whatever strength remained in his body, because that was his way, order first, always. But the truth was undeniable. His cough grew worse. His body weakened. The silence that had once filled rooms with weight now sometimes sounded like absence. And every soldier, every capo, every rival watching knew what that meant. The end was near. And when Neil was gone, the dam he had built with his silence would shatter. The flood was coming. Everyone was just waiting for the first crack. By the winter of 1985, Aniello Dellacroce knew his time was nearly gone. The cough had hollowed him out, his once steady hands shook even as he tried to light a cigarette, and his sharp frame had thinned to the point where coats hung loose on him. But until the very last days, he never let the family see weakness. He still made the trip to the Ravenite Social Club, still sat in the same chair, still carried the silence that kept men steady. Frail or not, his presence alone was enough to quiet a room. Soldiers lowered their voices, capos leaned in, and no one dared break the calm he brought. The FBI watched closely. Their notes described his pale skin, his slowed steps, the way his breathing labored. But even those agents admitted the truth in their reports. As long as Dellacroce lived, the family remained in check. His silence was the last barrier between Paul Castellano's cold, detached rule and John Gotti's fiery ambition. Everyone, lawmen, soldiers, even rivals, understood that once Neil was gone, the floodgates would burst. At home on Staten Island, his world had grown smaller. The crucifix above the mantel stayed in its place. The ashtray was still cleaned every night. The old clock still ticked in its steady rhythm. Soldiers came one by one, never in groups, never staying long. They sat at his kitchen table under the glow of the lamp, speaking little, waiting for Aniello's quiet judgment. Sometimes all they received was a look. sometimes a single question. And yet, they left knowing their futures had been decided. Even in weakness, his silence remained a verdict. Gotti visited more often than anyone. His ambition by now was obvious, his frustration with Castellano no secret. He came to Neil restless, his words spilling out in quick bursts. And Neil, thin and frail, still listened with the same patience as always. Once, when Gotti fumed about Paul's arrogance, Aniello said quietly, "Don't stand in front of the dam when it breaks." Gotti never forgot those words. In his silence, Aniello had given him the only permission he would ever need. In December, as his illness advanced, a priest came to his home. Aniello accepted communion, the wafer pressed to his tongue, his eyes closed in stillness. When asked if he had anything to confess, his voice was so faint it was almost imagined. "Tell him I never broke the code." That was all. No speeches. No final warnings. Just a man of silence, keeping it until the very end. Soon after, Aniello Dellacroce was gone. And almost immediately, the dam burst. Within days, Paul Castellano was cut down outside a steakhouse, his body sprawled on the cold pavement while John Gotti ascended to power. The storm Aniello had held back with silence had finally broken loose. But his legacy endured. To those who knew him, Dellacroce was never remembered for flashy suits or public headlines. He was remembered for the silence that carried more weight than words ever could. Silence that held a family together. Silence that outlived him. And even today, whispers say the same thing: if you heard nothing, it was Neil. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. If you found yourself drawn into the silence of Aniello Dellacroce, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, let the quiet steady you, and may the silence carry you into rest.